Well, we want to thank you again for joining us. I'm Houma-Thibodaux with the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux, a series of videos that we are bringing to you where we're hopefully going to answer the questions, the many questions I'm sure that people have as we prepare for the start of school in such an unprecedented time as this pandemic as we're dealing with. And again, I'm joined by the Superintendent of Catholic Schools, Suzanne Troxclair. Suzanne, the very first thing we want to start with in this particular part or video in this series, we've talked about a bunch of topics and we're going to talk about 5 or 6 again today. I want to start with one very, very important point, which is simply the hard work, making sure people understand the hard work that is going on behind the scenes a lot of the times at all of our schools in the diocese, in these very important times as we prepare for the start of school.
Right. These schools are working very hard to prepare for that safe return to their campuses for our students and our school staff as well. A lot goes into that. A lot that we would probably take for granted on any other year, but this year some very intentional work has to happen. In terms of, for instance, maximizing space within their schools on their physical plans, they are doing things like removing furniture from classrooms that aren't necessary, maximizing that classroom space to be able to maintain appropriate social distancing for their students, figuring out things like lunchroom. How are we going to feed all of our students? That's something that they have to have specifically in their plan to address. As a diocese, we've said before, we worked with an important task force to put some diocesan guidelines in place for our schools. And then in turn, our schools develop their return to school plans. And in their plans, they're addressing these types of things: social distancing, symptom monitoring, all of those things that are going to have to take place during this unprecedented time as our students and our staffs return to school. So a lot is going into that right now. Our administrators, many of our teachers are at those schools right now, maximizing space, planning for how students are going to drink water, for instance, in a time like this. How are they going to enter and exit a cafeteria or have an alternate place for their lunch? Those types of things are happening right now.
You just did a beautiful job, actually, of touching very quickly on some of the topics actually we're going to talk about in this video, which includes food service and water and those type of things in our schools. But one thing we need to mention before we go any further, we are talking about Catholic schools in the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. That means something, we're very biased obviously, but that means something very special. And it's something we're going to call Catholic identity. We're there to provide obviously excellent academic environment, but also the spiritual development of those students is critically important. You might want to address that.
Absolutely. It's what makes us unique. It's what makes us different. We have many wonderful schools in our area and in our state. However, our Catholicity is what sets us apart. As Catholic schools, we are a ministry of the Church's larger mission. So each and every day in all that we do, it has to be infused with our Catholic identity. So schools are planning for that as well. For example, on campus, they are preparing for maybe an alternate way that they do morning prayer. Some would gather as a large group, as a large school community in the morning. That will look different. So part of their plans is also how are they going to address those aspects of our Catholicity that may need to be done in a little bit of a different way. For example, masses, weekly masses in many of our schools will look a little different because of our size restrictions, our capacity restrictions in a specific phase. They may not be able to gather the whole school in one room together for Mass. So they're planning things like live streaming Mass into classrooms, having alternate classes attend in person. So all of those plans will be very specific to each school because all of their physical plans are different. So it's going to be very important for the parents to stay in close communication with their school to know what their school is doing for those particular things.
Another topic we want to talk about, and this is perhaps for our parents watching this, is you hear a lot about going back to school, regardless of the school system where it is, anywhere in our country. Here's a phrase that perhaps they have not heard yet, but I think they need to be prepared because they're going to hear a little bit more, which is what we call benchmark assessments, which is basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, because of the way we had to end our last school year with virtual learning, our schools need to ascertain or determine very early in the school year, where is that student in terms of where they're supposed to be, the benchmark, if you will, at the beginning of this school year. You might want to better explain that to parents.
Right, and so, benchmark assessment, again, is something that's an educational term, and parents may not think about it. However, it is something that is always done in our schools, but it will be very intentional, and you will hear about it more specifically this year, in whole, because we have been out of our physical plants for some time now. And although we continue with virtual learning, with distance learning, it is not exactly the same as being in class with a teacher and those students every single day. So it's important that teachers know where students are from the very beginning. And when I say that this is something that we've always done, it is, although you may not have heard mention of it necessarily, it's part of what good teaching entails. So those teachers, those schools will be very intentional in making sure they determine where students are academically, especially with our younger students and literacy, because learning to read is such a critical time in a child's life. So they have very intentional plans on what the tools they'll be using for benchmark assessments and how they'll take that to drive instruction, because we need to be taking our kids from where they are as far as they can go academically. So that is going to be very intentional. They will use their own methods that they have in place. They have different tools in place depending on what they use now. They may be choosing some additional tools as well, but I'm confident that all of our schools will be doing an excellent job with that.
3 topics we're going to wrap up this video with, and 3 things that we kind of already briefly addressed earlier in the video in terms of water, food service or lunch for our students, and also transportation and busing. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk about water. That typical thing is when we went to school and you're thirsty, you walk up to the water fountain, you turn the little handle. That's not going to happen in that way. And you might want to tell us, based on the guidance we have right now, what do parents need to know in terms of their students and water while they're at school?
Right. And again, something we often took for granted in a regular school year. But because of the restrictions with going back to school and having that safe environment for our students, we won't be utilizing our water fountains during this period. So that typical child walking up to a water fountain to have a drink of water at recess or after recess, we won't be able to do that now. So their water fountains will be closed during this time to limit that risk. And schools will be utilizing water bottles. So some schools, and it will vary from school to school, some schools are actually providing a specific bottle from their school for those students. Many of our schools also have water filling stations, water bottle filling stations that are touchless, that they'll be able to use to refill those water bottles. Many of the schools are asking parents in their plans to provide water bottles for their children to bring to school. And of course, all of our schools will have extra water bottles in the event that a child forgets their water or runs out and they need to be hydrated. We will definitely make sure our children stay hydrated. So that's going to look a little different for a while.
Right. Another thing that's going to look different is lunch. We know the way we would go to lunch at school, and again, knowing full well that what we're about to talk about and what you're about to address will look different from school to school. We understand that. But just generally so parents understand the guidance that we have been receiving, how is lunch likely to look, at least in most cases in our schools coming up this fall?
That's a great question. And another thing we would take for granted, but our schools are giving parents the option to provide their student with lunch coming from home, or they'll be able to eat the cafeteria lunch. Now, due to, again, size restrictions and trying to just limit the movement of students, many of our schools are not utilizing their cafeterias, or at least not to the same degree that they would have to feed the students in the cafeteria. Many of them will be eating either in their classrooms, in alternate settings in the school, outside on pretty days when that's allowed. So it will look different. Parents will be able to have the option of allowing their child to bring lunch, and also they will many times not be eating actually in the cafeteria. Although for some schools, It works for them, and especially some of the younger students, they're trying to utilize the cafeteria for those younger students to be able to eat and to be settled, of course maintaining social distancing at that time. But when those students get up and move, if another class has to come in, they'll have to disinfect all of those seats and those tables. So that is a little bit time consuming, which is the reason they're trying to maximize their school space to be able to feed the students appropriately.
I can tell you another topic, the final topic we'll talk about in this video in the series, of course, is busing, transportation. I mean, you know, with the number of thousands of students that we have in our Catholic schools that we're blessed to have here in our diocese, obviously they all got to get to school every day, and that's going to be interesting. People have obviously been seeing the press accounts about busing, and depending on what phase you're going to be in, what is the capacity of the bus and all that. Let me just start this final segment by maybe asking this simple question, Suzanne. Is it safe to say that we as a diocese, Office of Catholic Schools, maybe even our individual schools, are we recommending or suggesting that if at all possible parents should consider bringing their children to school? Not saying that bus transportation is not available, it will, but in the situation being that we're dealing with, I'm sure that percentage of parents bringing kids to school will probably go a bit higher in this current situation.
Parents will have to make that decision on what's in the best, interest of their child and what's feasible for their families. I've been a working parent my whole career, so I understand in some cases they may need to depend on bus service. Bus service will only be available once the public school system starts in-person instruction. So we have 3 civil parishes within our diocese, St. Mary Parish, part of St. Mary Parish, Terrebonne Parish, and Lafourche Parish. They all have different start dates for their return to their physical plants, to school. So we will not have bus transportation in those parishes from the public school system, which is what we utilize for bus transportation, until they start in-person instruction. So parents do need to make that decision, because from the state are specific guidelines and mandates about the capacity of buses in different phases. So currently we're in phase 2. If school starts while we are in phase 2, buses are limited to 50% of their manufacturer's suggested capacity. So if a bus, of course, has a, say a 50-person capacity, that limits them at 50% to 25 students on that bus. They'll be making a lot of adjustments, I'm sure, to their schedules and their routes because of that, to be able to accommodate everyone. So with that said, at phase 2, that would greatly impact how many children could be on a bus at one time. So a parent has the option, of course, to be able to bring their child to school. So they'll need to weigh that as a family, as parents of the children, of course, and decide, is this something that I can do once the buses are operating? Is this something I want to do to just, to keep my child and bring them to school myself? Or do I need to utilize those buses? So they'll need to weigh that on a family-by-family basis.
Right. Again, we want to thank Suzanne Troxclair, the Superintendent of Catholic Schools in the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. Yet another in a series of videos that we're doing where we're trying to bring you up to speed, if you will, on all these various topics. If you're a parent, we understand perhaps the confusion and the impatience and wanting all the answers and realizing it's such a fluid situation. We say it all the time, and it continues to be as we inch a little bit closer to the actual start of the school year. Again, I want to thank you for joining us. Hang in there with us, because every few days we're updating with the new video to again address more topics, and we have some more to come. So I want to thank you for joining us again, and God bless you.